They thought two new girls would be easy targets. They never imagined they were trained fighters, hiding behind innocent smiles. When silence turns to storm, who really wins, the bullies or the ones they've underestimated? It began with silence, not the heavy, sorrowful kind that follows tragedy, but the sharp, breathless silence that coils around your throat when you realize you're somewhere you were never meant to be. From the very first moment, Maya Carter and her twin sister Milan crossed the towering iron gates of Crestwood Academy. They understood this was not going to be a story of welcome. It would be a war, and the battlefield would not be fought with swords or guns, but with glances, whispers, walls built from invisible bricks of exclusion. Boston's morning sun gleamed coldly off the polished stone, a thousand small reflections flashing like warnings. The Academy's motto, Tradition, Excellence, Honor, was carved into every arch and every pillar. But tradition had never been built with girls like Maya and Milan in mind. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the marble as they entered the main hall. Students parted around them, not rudely, not loudly, but with an eerie, calculated indifference, like a river flowing around rocks it deemed too jagged to touch. Maya caught a flicker of something across a sea of navy blue blazers, a curl of a lip here, a raised eyebrow there. No one spoke. No one had to. Crestwood Academy was speaking to them in a language far older than words. You do not belong here. That was the welcome. That was the greeting written into every glance, every stiff shoulder turned away. What no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that the Carter twins were not tourists in hostile territory. They were warriors disguised in pressed uniforms and tight braids. Warriors raised by a father who had survived 1,000 battles no one had ever seen. The Carter girls carried not just their dreams but their training years of it etched into their bones like iron into steel. They were black belts, fighter, students of control, of discipline, of calculated force, held back by the thinnest of threads. It would only take one spark before we dive deeper into what happens next. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now to support our channel. Your support is what keeps us bringing you powerful stories like this. And trust me, you don't want to miss how this one ends. It's a ride you will never forget. Back at the school entrance, the clock struck 8:00 a.m. with a chime that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Maya adjusted the strap of her backpack, feeling the weight of it dig into her shoulder, but it was nothing compared to the other weight she carried. The burden of expectation of proving herself again in a world eager to see her fail. Milan glanced at her sister, their unspoken language alive between them. A tiny nod passed from one twin to the other, so small no one watching would have noticed. It said everything. Hold the line inside the Carter household. Holding the line was not a suggestion, it was a commandment. Their father, Darius Carter, a retired Army officer and seasoned martial artist, had raised them to understand that some battles were fought in silence before they ever erupted into noise. This world will try to erase you. He had told them countless times, his voice like gravel and thunder. Your job is not to let them. As the day unfolded, the subtle battles began. During morning announcements, the headmaster barely glanced at them as he welcomed new students without calling their names. In English class, assigned seating seemed strangely coincidental. Maya and Milan at the edges of the room, isolated islands in a sea of old money and older prejudice. At lunch, they carried their trays through the cafeteria, feeling invisible ropes tug the students away from every table they approached. They finally sat alone under a window, the cold sunlight making their isolation feel even sharper. It wasn't the first time they had been outsiders, but here at Crestwood it felt different. It felt sharpened. It felt personal. Maya picked at her food in silence, the plastic fork heavy in her hand. Milan sat across from her, pretending not to notice the glances, the not-so-subtle whispers behind cupped hands. Pretending for now. Outside, beyond the manicured lawns and centuries-old oak trees, the city of Boston thrived and churned, but inside Crestwood's walls, time seemed frozen in an older, crueler rhythm. Later that day, as they wandered the winding stone paths behind the science building, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a sleek, modern gymnasium with banners advertising the Crestwood Fencing Club. Tryouts. Maya paused, reading the bold calligraphic letters, fencing. Milan said, her voice light but edged with an excitement. Maya immediately recognized. Precision speed control, Maya murmured. Sounds familiar. They grinned, real smiles for the first time all day. It was more than a sport. It was an opportunity, a way to infiltrate this place that had already written them off to claim space, not with complaints, but with undeniable skill. The next day, they signed up without hesitation. Inside the gym, the twins watched as older students parried and lunged under Coach Reynolds's sharp eye. The white uniforms, the flash of steel. It was beautiful in its violence, almost poetic. Coach Reynolds, a stern woman with gray-streaked hair pulled into a bun, raised an eyebrow at the twins when they introduced themselves. Any experience, Bex? She asked, clipboard in hand. A little, Milan said with a smile that concealed far more than it revealed. Coach Reynolds smirked, skeptical, but skepticism was just another form of underestimation. And underestimation was the Carter twins' secret weapon. In the evenings after Crestwood's ancient halls closed their doors, the girls returned home to a different kind of training ground. A battered mat in the living room walls lined with trophies, not for academics or debating, but for breaking boards, for pinning opponents twice their size, for mastering forms so ancient they were written into the marrow of their bones. Darius Carter didn't train his daughters for sport. He trained them for survival. The world doesn't fight fair, he had told them, squaring off under the flickering light of their apartment's lone ceiling fan. So neither can you. That night, as Maya drove her palm into the air practicing an invisible strike, she whispered under her breath, "Let them underestimate us." Milan, stretching by the window, answered without looking, "It'll be their first mistake." And the first mistake in any battle was often the last. At Crestwood, the battle had only just begun, but the Carter twins were already warriors in a war no one else knew had started. They would not start the fight, but when it came, and it would come, they would be ready. And when they struck back, it would not be out of anger. It would be out of precision, out of principle, out of the unstoppable momentum of two girls who had been trained their whole lives for this very moment. The silence that had met them at the gates of Crestwood would not last forever. The storm was coming, and Maya and Milan Carter would not be washed away. They would become the storm. Before we continue, here's a quick question to get you thinking and interacting. If you were in Maya and Milan's shoes, what would you do first? A, fight back immediately and risk everything. B, stay calm, gather evidence, and strike when the time is right. Comment your answer below with A or B. I'll be reading every response and featuring the best ones in the next video. By the second week, Crestwood Academy had made its position brutally clear. It wasn't through policies or official words. It was quieter than that, more insidious, a slow suffocation, by omission, by looks, by the thousand small slights that told Maya and Milan Carter they were unwelcome. It began with the morning shuffle in the hallways. Groups of students moved seamlessly around them, clusters splitting and reforming as though the Carter twins carried a contagious disease no one wanted to catch. Conversations dimmed as they passed by, only to resume in quick, breathless bursts once they were out of earshot. Teachers who should have been neutral anchors in this sea of quiet hostility sometimes seemed just as complicit. Their greetings were clipped. Their smiles strained their attention, careful and distant. At first, Maya and Milan tried to dismiss it. They had faced coldness before at other schools, other cities, but there was something different about Crestwood's cruelty. It was sharpened by generations of entitlement, honed to a gleaming edge by centuries of inherited power. Here, racism was not shouted across a playground. It was whispered behind mahogany doors and engraved into the very stones of the courtyard. It wasn't long before the hostility shifted from passive to active. In the library, Maya would find her assigned textbooks missing her name scrawled with ink across the checkout list in crude, ugly mockeries. Milan once returned from lunch to find her art project 3 weeks in the making, shredded and crumpled under her desk. At fencing practice, Coach Reynolds always seemed to forget to call their names for team drills, leaving the twins sparring only with each other while the others trained in rotation. It wasn't punishment, it was erasure, and that was worse. The worst offender, of course, was Chase Whitmore. Chase moved through Crestwood's marble halls like a king surveying his kingdom. Blonde wealthy, his blazer always slightly unbuttoned, like he was too important to be bothered by rules. Wherever he went, people laughed a little louder, cleared the path a little faster. He didn't just represent Crestwood's legacy, he was its sharpest weapon. At first, Chase kept his cruelty low-key, a shoulder bump here, a mocking smile there. A whisper dropped just loudly enough for Maya or Milan to hear as they passed. Lost again, or shouldn't they be cleaning the floors instead? Every insult was crafted to seem deniable, every shove disguised as an accident. It was psychological warfare, dressed in prep school polish. But Darius Carter had trained his daughters for this battlefield long before they knew its name. At home, their evenings became war councils around the battered kitchen table. Darius didn't rage at the injustice, didn't waste breath on anger. He listened. He questioned. He prepared. What is the goal of a bully? He asked one evening, his voice low, deliberate. To get a reaction, Maya answered, her knuckles pale where they gripped her glass of water. To break your discipline, Milan added, her eyes shadowed but burning. Darius nodded satisfaction flickering briefly across his face. And what do? You hold. They answered together. And when you strike me, he pressed. When the time is right, Maya said, and only to end it. Milan finished. It wasn't a question of if things would escalate. It was a question of when Crestwood was pushing them toward the cliff's edge, testing whether they would jump or if, like everyone assumed, they would fall. The most insidious moments came in the fencing club, the one place Maya and Milan had believed they could carve out something of their own. Here the stakes were not just physical, but symbolic. Here skill was supposed to matter more than lineage or race. But reality had other plans. Coach Reynolds, under the thin veil of impartiality, found ways to box the twins out. Drills where partners were assigned carefully to leave them only each other. Critiques that came sharper, harsher when directed at Maya and Milan, often ignoring the sloppiness of favored students like Chase fencing. Tournaments loomed on the calendar and selections for the varsity roster were approaching fast. The twins knew they would need to be undeniably good, so good that even systemic bias couldn't ignore them. So they trained harder than ever. Mornings before school found them running drills in the frost-dusted park near their apartment. After practice ended at Crestwood when their classmates headed off to cafes or parties, Maya and Milan stayed late perfecting their footwork under the flickering lights of the gym. On weekends, Darius pushed them through grueling endurance sessions that left them aching and breathless but honed. Each insult, each shove, each petty sabotage only fueled them. You can survive anything if you turn pain into purpose, Darius reminded them after one particularly brutal training session where Maya had collapsed onto the mat, fists clenched in frustrated rage. Pain into purpose. That was the mantra they carried through every frigid morning jog, every ignored question in class, every smirking look from Chase, Whitmore, and his sycophants. But survival had its limits. One afternoon, after a particularly punishing fencing session, where Coach Reynolds had openly praised a mediocre lunge from Chase while nitpicking Milan's flawless riposte, the twins headed toward their lockers and found something waiting for them. Taped across the sleek metal doors were two sheets of paper. Each one showed a grotesque caricature, brown faces exaggerated to monstrous proportions, dressed in janitor uniforms scrawled underneath in red marker. Crestwood's real heritage. For a moment, neither Maya nor Milan moved. The hallway was oddly quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Maya felt it first, the roar building in her chest, the instinct to tear the paper down and shred it into 1,000 pieces. But beside her, she sensed Milan's stillness, not frozen, calculating. They had trained for this, not just with fists, with minds, with strategy. Maya inhaled slowly, feeling the rage cool into something sharper. She pulled the papers down with deliberate care, folded them neatly, and slid them into her backpack. Proof. The security cameras overhead blinked red in their casing, tiny, unblinking eyes. Let them record. Let them gather the evidence that would build quietly, invisibly, until the weight of it became too heavy for even Crestwood's gilded walls to hold. Chase watched from across the hall, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His cronies snickered behind cupped hands, but when Maya met his gaze, there was no anger in her face, only a promise. You started this, she thought. You have no idea how it ends. Over the following days, the attacks escalated. A spilled soda, accidentally ruining Milan's science project. A stolen fencing mask replaced with one cut down the middle. Rumors whispered through the hallways, cheap, ugly lies about the Carter twins' family, their scholarships, their worth. But Maya and Milan never cracked. Each time they gathered evidence, each time they documented, each time they pushed forward with heads held high, it drove Chase mad. Bullies don't crave victory, they crave surrender. And the twins refused to surrender. Inside, though the tension twisted tighter with every passing day at home, Darius saw it. The tightness in Maya's jaw, the rigid set of Milan's shoulders. He didn't push them to speak. He simply made sure they sharpened their weapons, mental, emotional, physical. In the evenings, the twins practiced takedown drills. In the mornings, they revised their fencing forms until muscle memory drowned out doubt, pain into purpose. And all the while, in the silent places where the mind wanders when exhaustion sets in, they asked themselves the question they had sworn never to voice. How much longer? How many more slights? How many more humiliations? How long before the storm broke? They knew the answer was coming faster than anyone realized. The hallways buzzed with the growing electricity of anticipation. Teachers began watching the twins with tighter, wary expressions, as if sensing the inevitable crack in the dam. Students whispered louder when they passed their cruelty, no longer hidden but flaunted. Crestwood Academy thought it knew its predators and its prey. It had no idea what it had unleashed. And Chase Whitmore, drunk on his own impunity, was about to push too far. Far enough that not even the Carter twins' iron discipline could hold back the storm that had been building quiet and certain in the marrow of their bones. The question was no longer whether Maya and Milan would fight. The question was when. And when the moment came, it would be a reckoning. Crestwood would never forget. The day began like any other at Crestwood Academy, with its thin veil of civility stretched tightly over the roiling tension that lurked beneath. The sun, cast clean, bright lines across the courtyard, and students moved with their typical ease, laughing, whispering, carrying books that looked heavier than they were. Yet something in the air was different, heavier, waiting. Maya Carter sensed it the moment she and her sister Milan stepped through the gates. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in how the crowd shifted around them, a tremor just below the surface, the kind animals sense before an earthquake. Milan felt it too. Her eyes flicked up toward the clusters of students gathering near the fencing gym, toward the teachers who stood a little farther off today, their faces deliberately neutral, toward Chase Whitmore and his loyal pack lounging by the steps, with smirks that curved too sharply, glances that lingered too long. Trouble today. It wasn't hiding, but the Carter twins did not turn back. They walked forward, heads high, steps deliberate, just as they had been taught. Each footfall an act of rebellion against everything Crestwood had tried to make them feel. Each stride a declaration. We are not afraid. They had no idea how far Chase was willing to go, but they would find out soon enough. The first blow came not with fists, but with spectacle. When Maya reached her locker, her hands froze before they touched the combination dial. Red paint dripped down the door, splattered and crude. The words scrawled in jagged letters too loud to ignore. Go back where you belong. It was the kind of cruelty that didn't just wound. It branded. It marked. And it was public deliberately so. All around them, the courtyard fell into an unnatural silence, as if the entire school had been holding its breath for this exact moment. Phones rose, recording. Whispers rushed through the air like wildfire through dry grass. Milan's locker was no better. Her door had been defaced with cartoonish racist caricatures, exaggerated features, grotesque and vicious. Papers were stuffed through the vents, fluttering to the ground as she opened it, each one carrying slurs and taunts, each one a paper cut aimed at their very souls. For a few long seconds, neither sister moved. Maya felt the sting of humiliation bite deep like acid on her skin. Her vision blurred for a heartbeat, not from tears, but from rage, so sharp it made her dizzy. Milan stood rigid, the muscles in her arms coiled tight, her fists clenched at her sides until her knuckles turned white. Across the courtyard, Chase. Whitmore leaned casually against a pillar, arms folded, a smirk carved into his handsome face. Zach and Brent flanked him, laughing too loud, their satisfaction oozing across the distance between them like poison. This was no spontaneous prank. It was theater, a public execution of dignity. Chase's gaze caught Maya's, and without breaking eye contact, he mimed a sweeping bow, mockery thick in every movement. Maya felt a cold clarity settle over her, the way calm sometimes comes before a storm tears the world apart. Beside her, Milan let out a slow, controlled breath. Their father's voice rose in their mind, steady as a heartbeat. Control is power. Without a word, the twins bent to begin cleaning the mess. They moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of a meltdown. Each piece of paper was gathered with a grace that mocked the cruelty intended by those who had planted them. Each wipe of the locker doors stripped away not just the paint, but the invisible chains Chase had tried to wrap around them. But they knew this was a line crossed, and once a line is crossed, there is no returning. By the time Coach Reynolds approached, her face stiff with discomfort. She barely tried to mask the damage was already done. She muttered something about unfortunate incidents and administrative follow-up before quickly retreating, leaving Maya and Milan alone with their shame and their rage. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, disappointment flickering across their faces when the twins refused to cry. refused to break. But Chase wasn't done. He wanted to shatter them publicly. He wanted to see the collapse. The next confrontation was inevitable. It came later that afternoon in the courtyard, just as the last bell echoed through the ancient hallways of Crestwood students, poured out buzzing with the kind of anticipatory energy that precedes a fight no one wants to miss. Maya and Milan were walking toward the front gates when Chase stepped into their path, flanked by Zach and Brent, like the world's worst welcoming committee. "Thought you two would have learned by now," Chase said, voice pitched loud enough to draw a crowd. His smirk widened when the students began to circle, sensing the entertainment about to unfold. Maya kept her gaze level, her body still. Milan stood beside her, muscles taut with restraint. "You don't belong here," Chase continued, stepping closer. "No matter how many trophies you think you can win, no matter how hard you smile for the cameras." Someone in the crowd snickered. "Maybe we should help you find your way back to wherever it is you people come from." Zach added, his words slurred with contempt. Brent laughed a cruel, ugly sound. Maya felt Milan shift beside her, the smallest movement almost imperceptible. She knew her sister was calculating the angles, the exits, the openings, reading the battlefield, the way they had been trained to do. Chase stepped closer still until he was just inches away. Maya could smell the expensive cologne he wore, could see the tiny scar above his eyebrow, could feel the hatred radiating from him like heat from asphalt. "Say something," he hissed so low only they could hear. "I dare you." Maya met his gaze, her voice quiet but clear. "You already said enough." Chase's face twisted in fury. And then he shoved her. It wasn't a hard shove, more theatrical than violent, but it was enough to send Maya stumbling back a step. Gasps echoed around the courtyard. Cameras rose again. The Carter twins had held their line for weeks. They had absorbed insult after insult, blow after blow, humiliation after humiliation. But this was the final straw. Milan moved first. Swift controlled a blur of motion, born from years of training and discipline. She stepped between Chase and her sister, her body a shield, her stance low and ready. Chase, emboldened by the crowd, lunged, and Maya, steady now, sidestepped with a precision that seemed almost effortless, grabbing Chase's wrist mid-swing and twisting it back toward him. He yelped, surprise and pain flashing across his face. Brent charged next. A clumsy, angry rush. Milan caught his momentum, pivoted smoothly, and sent him sprawling to the ground with a clean sweep of his legs. Zach hesitated, but only for a second before barreling toward Maya. She ducked low, drove a palm into his gut, and watched him collapse forward with a grunt, gasping for air. It wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration, a reminder that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it moves with deadly, beautiful efficiency. By the time the teachers finally arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, the courtyard was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, not the oppressive, complicit silence that had greeted the Carter twins since the day they arrived. This was the stunned silence of realization. The Carter twins were not victims. They were not prey. They were not symbols to be pitied or trophies to be mocked. They were warriors. Coach Reynolds pushed through the crowd, her eyes darting from the fallen boys to the Carter sisters, confusion and fear battling for dominance in her expression. "What happened here?" she demanded. Maya and Milan said nothing. They didn't need to. The evidence lay sprawled across the marble courtyard, Chase, Zach, and Brent groaning and humiliated, their superiority shattered as thoroughly as the lies they had built it upon. As administration swept in, ushering everyone away, Maya and Milan exchanged a glance. It was not a glance of triumph, it was a glance of inevitability. They had not started this war. But now they had answered. And nothing at Crestwood Academy would ever be the same again. The silence that fell after the courtyard fight was not the stunned, awed kind that follows victory. It was the heavy, leaden silence of inevitability, the kind that carries the weight of consequences. Maya and Milan Carter stood side by side as the administrators ushered the crowd away, their faces unreadable, their breathing steady. They had not come seeking this war, but now that it had found them, they faced it with their heads held high. There was no triumph in their posture, only an unshakable calm. They knew what was coming, and it came fast. Within the hour, they were summoned to the administrative offices flanked by two tight-faced security guards whose presence was more for show than necessity. Darius Carter was already there when they arrived, seated with the unyielding patience of a man who had long ago learned that the world would try to bend him at every opportunity. Across from him sat Headmaster Harrington, his pristine suit as stiff as the words he barely seemed able to form. "There has been a serious incident." Harrington began, his voice low, his hands folded carefully atop the mahogany desk. Maya and Milan said nothing. They let the silence stretch heavy and accusatory, waiting for the man to force himself to say what they all already knew. "In light of the events this afternoon pending a full investigation, we are placing Maya and Milan Carter on temporary suspension." Harrington finally said the words spilling out in a practiced rush. Effective immediately suspension. Not just the bullies who had orchestrated the attack. Not just Chase Whitmore and his sneering entourage, Maya and Milan. The victims punished because they refused to accept the role Crestwood had written for them. Darius Carter didn't flinch. His daughters didn't either. And Chase Whitmore. Darius asked, his voice a quiet, lethal thing. Harrington shifted in his seat, the skin around his eyes tightening. "Mr. Whitmore is also being evaluated," he said carefully. "Evaluated, not suspended, not held accountable, evaluated." The twins exchanged a glance, a wordless conversation passing between them. They had expected this. They had prepared for this. And still, the injustice burned hot and sharp in their chests. They gathered their belongings under the watchful eyes of administrators, moving slowly, deliberately. Crestwood's halls seemed colder now, its polished marble floors slick with betrayal. Students watched from doorways and corners, their faces, masks of curiosity, shame, and in a few rare cases, silent solidarity. But no one spoke. No one stepped forward. Maya and Milan left the school grounds flanked by their father, the three of them cutting a path through the cold afternoon light like a wedge of unbroken steel. The moment they stepped into their modest home, Darius Carter's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the composed, silent observer of injustices. He could not immediately change. He was a general preparing for war. "We're not letting this stand," he said, his voice low. Even Maya felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly. Milan nodded, sharp and certain. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. It was about justice. It was about making sure that the next students who dared to dream beyond the boxes society built for them wouldn't have to face the same walls alone. That night, Darius Carter made a call. Attorney Naomi Fields arrived the next morning, a powerhouse civil rights lawyer. Naomi carried herself with the calm intensity of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. She sat at their kitchen table, flipping through the folder of evidence. Maya and Milan had been meticulously gathering photos of the graffiti, screenshots of hateful messages, copies of their filed complaints ignored by school staff. "You've built a strong case," Naomi said, after an hour of careful review. "But strength isn't enough at places like Crestwood. We'll need leverage." She leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp. "We're going public." The plan was simple and devastating. Expose Crestwood's culture of silence. Shame the administration into accountability. and shine a light so bright even their thick stone walls couldn't block it out. Naomi coached them on every detail: what to say, what not to say, how to frame their experience not as isolated victims, but as part of a larger, undeniable pattern. The local news picked up the story, first a short segment buried between weather updates and minor crime reports. But it was enough to spark the first ripple. Within days, larger outlets began calling regional papers, cable news, even national education-focused blogs and networks. Crestwood Academy, once known only for its pristine lawns and Ivy League acceptance rates, was suddenly being talked about in an entirely different light. Reporters camped outside the wrought iron gates. Parents flooded the headmaster's office with furious demands for explanations. Students whispered in the halls, torn between fear and the first stirrings of long-buried anger. Meanwhile, Maya and Milan stayed mostly out of sight, just as Naomi advised. They let the evidence and the silence of Crestwood's administration speak louder than any words could. At home, life moved in a strange suspended rhythm. Days spent preparing statements, nights spent together around the kitchen table, not as a family crushed under the weight of injustice, but as one hammering out a blueprint for resistance. Maya found herself staring at her own hands, sometimes wondering how these same fingers that had once clutched books and foils and dreams had become instruments of such necessary defiance. Milan grew quieter, more introspective. Her fierce energy turned inward, sharpening itself. And Darius Carter, always their rock, never once showed fear. "This isn't the end," he told them. One night, as the headlines blared across the TV screen, "It's the beginning," pressure mounted at Crestwood. Anonymous tips flooded newsrooms, stories of discrimination, favoritism, cover-ups stretching back decades. Former students came forward, their faces blurred on late-night segments, their voices shaking with emotion as they recounted eerily similar tales of exclusion and humiliation. Crestwood scrambled. Headmaster Harrington issued a bland, half-hearted public statement pledging a full internal review, but no one was fooled. The tide had turned, and then came the moment that no one at Crestwood could control: a leaked video. Shot by a student, the footage showed the confrontation in the courtyard. It showed Chase Whitmore lunging first. It showed Maya and Milan defending themselves with precision, not aggression. It showed everything. The video went viral. Within hours, justice for the Carter twins was trending across social media. Celebrities retweeted it. Activists demanded answers. Crestwood Academy's pristine facade cracked, splintered, and began to crumble, but victory, Maya realized, was not a simple thing. Even as public support surged, the backlash was vicious. Anonymous threats flooded their social media accounts. Old prejudices reared up, uglier and more poisonous when stripped of polite disguise. "You think you're heroes," one message sneered. "You're just troublemakers. You don't belong here," another hissed. The same message over and over. Only louder now, Maya and Milan leaned on each other. Through it all, they reminded themselves, as Darius always had, that survival wasn't about silencing pain. It was about transforming it into purpose. Naomi filed an official civil rights complaint against Crestwood. With the Department of Education, lawsuits were drafted. Community organizations rallied behind them, hosting forums, protests, donation drives. The Carter family stood at the center of a growing movement they had never intended to lead but could no longer step away from. Late one night, after an especially grueling interview, Milan slumped onto the couch, her voice raw. "Do you ever wish we'd just walked away?" she asked Maya, not accusing but aching. Maya sat down beside her, pulling her close. "Every day," she whispered. "And every day I'm glad we didn't." The road ahead was long and uncertain, but the Carter twins had chosen their path. They would not walk it alone, and they would not walk it quietly. They had fought back in the courtyard. Now they were fighting for something bigger, not just for themselves, but for every student who had ever been told they were less, for every voice silenced, for every dream deferred, for justice. And they would not stop until it was won. The final turning point arrived not with a shout, but with the slow, deliberate weight of inevitability. The official investigation into Crestwood Academy concluded on a rainy Wednesday, the kind of day where even the grand old building seemed to sag under the press of heavy clouds. A formal letter was delivered first to Naomi Fields, who read it twice silently before passing it across the table to the Carter family. Darius read it aloud, his voice steady. The Department of Education had found substantial evidence of systemic racial discrimination not only in the twins' case, but across multiple years and incidents. Crestwood was ordered to implement mandatory reforms, diversity training, an independent oversight board, the hiring of more diverse faculty. Restitution was demanded, financial penalties were imposed. Their accreditation status was placed under review, but perhaps most importantly, Chase Whitmore, Zach Turner, and Brent McCaffrey were permanently expelled, their records carrying the stain of their actions. Headmaster Harrington tendered his resignation the same afternoon. The walls of Crestwood had finally cracked. Maya sat back in her chair, feeling the words settle into her bones. Victory did not feel the way she had imagined. There was no roaring sense of triumph, no soaring symphony of vindication. Instead, there was a quiet, steady sense of rightness, of balance, long overdue. Milan exhaled slowly, her hands clasped tight on the table, her knuckles white. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "We didn't just survive it," she said, "we changed it." That night, their small kitchen filled with laughter for the first time in weeks. They ordered cheap takeout and toasted with plastic cups of soda. Naomi stayed late recounting battles she had fought and won, and some she had lost her words, weaving a tapestry of resilience that stretched far beyond Crestwood's ivy walls. "You'll never know everyone you helped," she told them as she prepared to leave. "But trust me, they're out there." In the weeks that followed, life resumed its rhythm, but nothing was quite the same. Maya and Milan returned to Crestwood, walking through the front gates, not as outcasts, but as survivors who had reshaped the very ground they walked on. Some students still looked away, still whispered behind their hands, but others greeted them openly. Now, nods, smiles, quiet, acknowledgments of what had been done and who had done it. The teachers, too, were changed. Some stiffened at the sight of the twins, bristling with unspoken resentment at the loss of their comfortable indifference, but others met their eyes fully offering something closer to respect. Respect born not of fear, but of recognition. The twins rejoined the fencing team, this time not as afterthoughts but as rightful champions. Coach Reynolds, faced with the weight of public scrutiny and internal pressure, was replaced by a new coach, an Olympian, a woman of color who had once been pushed to the margins herself. She greeted Maya and Milan with a firm handshake and a simple promise: if you work hard, you will rise. And rise they did. Their movements on the strip were sharper, now infused not just with physical precision, but with a burning clarity of purpose. Each parry, each riposte was a declaration. We are here. We are unbreakable. That spring at the state fencing championships, Maya and Milan stood side by side atop the podium, gold and silver medals hanging heavy around their necks. When the national anthem played, Maya closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, not as an anthem for a country that had so often failed them, but as a requiem for every doubt, every insult, every wall that had tried to hold them back. They had built something stronger from the wreckage. Legacy. The media eventually moved on as it always does. New scandals, new heroes, new tragedies to consume, but the impact of what the Carter family had done lingered quiet and persistent. Crestwood's halls bore the mark of change. Students who once kept their heads down began speaking up about curriculum gaps, about admissions, biases, about the subtle ways inequality wormed its way into even the most hallowed institutions. Some change was symbolic. Banners hung celebrating diversity. New scholarships announced. But some change was real. There were new names on honor rolls, new faces in leadership positions, new voices refusing to be silenced. At home, life blossomed in quieter ways. Maya discovered a love for writing, pouring her experiences into essays and stories that found their way into small but hungry online platforms. She wrote not for revenge, but for remembrance, to etch the truth into history, to ensure that silence never returned. Milan took to organizing, joining local youth advocacy groups, speaking at town halls with the same fierce passion she once reserved for fencing matches. Her voice carried in those rooms sharp and clear, slicing through the fog of bureaucracy with the certainty of lived experience. And Darius, he watched them with a pride that softened the hard lines of his face, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes that needed no words to be understood. He had taught them to stand. Now they were teaching others. On the first anniversary of the courtyard confrontation, Crestwood hosted a Day of Reflection, a carefully curated event meant to highlight the school's commitment to growth and justice. Maya and Milan were invited to speak. They debated it for weeks. Part of them wanted to refuse, wanted to spit the invitation back in the administration's face. But in the end, they realized something. They weren't accepting the school's approval. They were claiming their place. They stood on the polished stage of Crestwood's grand auditorium, the same place where they had once felt so invisible, so impossibly small. Maya stepped to the microphone first, her voice steady. "We came here to learn," she said, looking out over the sea of faces. "We didn't expect to have to teach, but we did." Milan stepped up beside her, her gaze sweeping the room. "And we're not asking for gratitude," she said. "We're asking for commitment, commitment to do better, to be better." There was silence at first, but then slowly, quietly, it grew. Applause. Real applause. Not everyone clapped. Some arms remained folded, some jaws tight with old resentment. But enough hands moved, enough feet shifted restlessly, enough hearts cracked open, just a sliver wider than before. It was enough. Later, as the twins walked across the campus under the soft light of the setting sun, they paused beneath the great oak tree near the courtyard, their old silent witness. Maya ran her hand along the bark rough and solid beneath her fingertips. "We changed it," she said softly. Milan smiled fierce and unbowed. "And we're just getting started." In the years to come, the story of Maya and Milan Carter would be told and retold, sometimes distorted, sometimes polished. Some would try to frame it as a tidy victory, a neat triumph over adversity. But those who had been there, those who had felt the thunder in the courtyard, who had watched the slow cracking of old rotting walls, they knew the truth. Victory wasn't one moment. It was every quiet choice to stand, every refusal to yield, every act of courage that left the world a little better than before. The Carter twins hadn't just changed Crestwood. They had changed themselves, and they had changed what was possible for everyone who would come after. As they stood together beneath the ancient branches, the last light of day painting the sky in colors too wild and beautiful to name, Maya and Milan understood something deeper than any medal or headline could capture. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. And theirs was only just beginning. When we reflect on the incredible journey of Maya and Milan Carter, we don't just remember the battles they fought. We remember the spirit they carried. From the moment they first walked through the intimidating gates of Crestwood Academy, to the day they stood victorious not just in the courtyard, but in the very heart of a broken system. Maya and Milan taught us what true resilience looks like. They arrived at Crestwood knowing they would stand out not because of their talents, not because of their dreams, but because of the color of their skin. From whispered slurs to cruel pranks, to open hostility, they bore the weight of prejudice that was not theirs to carry. They were pushed, mocked, isolated, and judged long before they ever had a chance to be known. Yet through it all, they chose dignity over anger. They chose control over chaos. They chose the long, hard road of resistance over the fleeting, easy comfort of silence. Their fight was never about one punch thrown in a courtyard. It was about every step they took before that day, every insult they absorbed, every smirk they ignored, every door they pushed through when the world whispered that they didn't belong. Their courage was not born in that final confrontation. It was built quietly, day after day in moments unseen by anyone else. It was built around their family table, where Darius Carter taught his daughters that their value was not up for debate. It was built in the late nights and early mornings in the drills and the sparring sessions, where strength became more than muscle. It became discipline. It became focus. It became spirit. It was built in every decision not to retaliate, in every choice to walk away until walking away was no longer an option. When the final moment came, when the world demanded they either bow or break, they stood. And they didn't just stand for themselves. They stood for every student who had been told to sit down, for every dream that had been quietly deferred, for every voice that had been choked back by fear. But standing came at a price: suspension, public scrutiny, hate disguised as commentary. The Carter family could have retreated. They could have decided that survival was enough, but they didn't. They transformed their personal pain into a public call for change. They went to the media, not for fame, but for justice. They fought not with fists, but with facts, with unwavering truth, with the simple, powerful insistence that they deserve to be treated as equals. Their story teaches us that true victory isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about holding on to your integrity when the world tries to strip it from you. It's about fighting, not because you hate what stands in front of you, but because you love what stands behind you: your dignity, your future, your community. Maya and Milan changed Crestwood, but more importantly, they changed the narrative. They showed that resilience isn't about hardening your heart or becoming indifferent. It's about keeping your heart soft enough to still hope, still dream, still fight for something better. They refused to let the hate they faced define them. Instead, they defined themselves through excellence, through courage, through unity. As they returned to Crestwood, walking once more through halls that had once been battlegrounds, they did so not as victims, not even just as survivors, but as pioneers. They had shifted something in the bones of that place. They had carved a path that others could follow so that no student would ever have to walk alone again. Their medals, their victories, their accolades, those were not the end of their journey. They were only milestones on a road that stretched long into the future. A future they helped reshape by refusing to accept anything less than their full humanity. The legacy they built wasn't about a single victory. It was about planting seeds, seeds of courage, of change, of hope that would grow long after their names faded from the headlines. And now, standing here, looking back at their story, we have to ask ourselves, what will we do with the legacy they left us? Because the truth is, the fight Maya and Milan faced at Crestwood is not unique to them. Prejudice, exclusion, injustice, they wear many faces and find new homes in every generation, and each of us at some point will face a choice. Will we stand quietly in the crowd, or will we step forward, even when it's terrifying, even when it's costly? Their story calls us to action, not just grand gestures, but small, everyday acts of resistance against injustice. Speaking up when it's easier to stay silent, reaching out to someone who's being left behind, building spaces where everyone, no matter where they come from, can stand tall without fear. And their story reminds us that true strength is not about dominating others. It's about standing your ground when everything inside you says to run. It's about choosing the harder, right over the easier, wrong. Today, in a world that still grapples with division and fear, the lessons of the Carter family are more urgent than ever. We must be the ones who build tables long enough for everyone to have a seat. We must be the ones who choose love over hate, courage over silence, justice over comfort. When we find ourselves facing our own versions of Crestwood, those spaces that whisper, "You don't belong," may we remember Maya and Milan. May we remember that the walls meant to contain us can be broken, that silence can be shattered, that dignity can be reclaimed, that legacies are not written by the powerful alone. They are written by those brave enough to resist, even when it feels impossible. So as you finish hearing their story today, ask yourself, what ground will you stand on? Whose hand will you reach for when the walls start closing in? What legacy will you leave behind? Not just with words, but with the way you live every single day. The Carters showed us the way. Now it's our turn to walk it. And now, let's make it fun and interactive. Here's a quick question for you. Which do you think was the Carter twins' greatest strength? A. Their physical skills and training. B. Their emotional resilience and unity. Drop your answer in the comments with A or B. I'd love to see what you think. Also, I'm curious, what lessons did you personally take away from Maya and Milan's journey? Comment below and share your thoughts so we can learn from each other. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us in bringing you more powerful and inspiring stories like this. Your support means the world. And if you feel inspired, you can donate to help us continue creating meaningful content, especially as the early days are always the hardest. Every little bit helps us stay independent, passionate, and focused on sharing stories that matter. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing hope. And remember, the storm may rage, the walls may rise, but together we stand. See you in the next story.